For today's video, we'll return to the topic of sequels, and why they can be considered a double-edged sword for developers, yet an important necessity when it comes to building the brand or franchise from a specific studio. Last week, there was an announcement about the sequel to the game Phantom Doctrine that we played a few months ago on stream. You can see it up there. It was a Cold War era kind of XCOM style game. While it wasn't the best game that we played, it had some very interesting parts to it. Stuff that we would assume could be refined and iterated on with a sequel. And with the sequel announcement came the reveal that it's going from being an XCOM style game to a third-person stealth game, kind of like Hitman. And it probably, and I'm sure it has, annoyed some of the fans out there. And is kind of the basis for our video today, and kind of, once again, discussing what are the important considerations about sequels, and the pros and cons surrounding them. As we've said before, sequels are usually met as a net positive for developers and publishers alike, for different reasons. For a developer point of view, the sequel is your chance to iterate and refine your idea. Part of the challenges of making a video game, especially the first entry in the series, is that you are building the foundation at the same time you're trying to flesh it out. And more often than not, the first game in the franchise is the testbed. This is the proof of concept to see if this kind of gameplay will resonate with people. And then we can then expand and refine that with future iterations. And I'm sure some of you will probably point to some exceptions to the rules in the comments, but when we look at franchises like Diablo, Doom, Castlevania, Mario, XCOM, you name it, just pick any major one, Assassin's Creed being one of the more notable examples of this. The first entries, while they are good games, they're always kind of not at their fullest potential. And it's up to the sequels to take these ideas and run with them, and will often determine whether or not the franchise as a whole is worth saving. But with that said, you still need that first game to wow people, because if people aren't loving your basic idea, what makes you think a publisher or developer will want to spend another 2 to 5 years working on another entry hoping that one will stick? Speaking of a publisher, another reason why sequels are favored from a publisher standpoint is that they are known quantities. There's so much that's up in the air about game development that any time that you can have a reasonable idea of what to expect, that is a net positive. If I know that 1.2 million copies were sold of Game 1, I can assume that around that number will work for Game number 2. Likewise, you can also point to sequels also adding to the brand and franchise recognition. That once people know about who you are and what your design is, there will be more people excited about the sequel, and then you can use that as further publicity. As we've said before with Red Hook Games, when Darkest Dungeon 1 came out, they were a relatively unknown unless you were following for the months and years during the Kickstarter and Early Access. Now, it's a different story. And when they announced Darkest Dungeon 2 in their trailer, it was, I think, like a 10-second long trailer, people got very excited. Again, Blizzard can throw Diablo insert number footage whenever they want, and it will make people jump out of their seats in joy. And that is the power of sequels, and more importantly, of building brands and franchises. But there are major risks that come with sequels, as well as the challenges of continuing to develop a franchise. So let's start with when a sequel goes too far away from the initial concept. In a way, it betrays the brand and franchise. And this is a very odd complaint, because we have seen over the years many games that become or are derived as spin-offs from their main game. Insert Mario title here, the Persona games being a spin-off of Shin Megami Tensei, the Final Fantasy spin-offs, the Kingdom Hearts spin-offs. There are a lot of them out there. And part of the reason why we see spin-offs is that they're a way of generating a renewed or continued interest in a brand without having or without necessarily developing more in that initial design. And as we've seen, there are many cases where the spin-offs can become so popular that they become their own franchise in their own right. Again, something like Persona, blowing up with Personas 4 and 5. Or even, I'm trying to remember some of the other big name examples, and I'm failing off the top of my head. Maybe it will come to me as I continue this thought. But people are fine with spin-offs because most often they assume that a main game in the series is being developed. Again, when we look at Nintendo, they can make as many weird and wacky spin-offs of Mario go-karting or ruining friendships with Mario Party because they know that Nintendo is always working on another mainline Mario and Zelda game. And I apologize to all the Metroid, F-Zero, Star Tropics, and I guess anyone else out there. And of course, they're always working on another Legend of Zelda game. But when we look at spin-offs, they have to be properly labeled as such. There's a reason why Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts angered fans, while XCOM Chimera Squad didn't do the same thing. When Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts was announced, it was considered and kind of pitched as Banjo-Kazooie 3. Now, I loved Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. It's one of my all-time favorite games. But in the same breath, it had very little to do with the previous games outside of featuring the principal characters. XCOM Chimera Squad made no bones about having nothing to do with being related to XCOM 2 and XCOM War of the Chosen. And it's important when you are approaching how you label sequels and spin-offs as to what they represent. Again, going back to the Mario example, people know that when you see Mario, insert a few more words there, that it's probably not going to be a 3D or 2D platformer. If we see again Super Mario whatever, we can assume that's going to be a platform, and we expect and come to know what kind of elements going to make up that game. Again, if we see a Call of Duty sequel announced, and then when we play it and it turns out to be a real-time strategy game, that's going to obviously piss off fans of the franchise. It could still be a great game in of itself. But again, you have to understand that part of the double-edged nature of sequels and branding along these lines is that you still have to adhere to that formula. You can iterate and refine, yes, but if this franchise is known for challenging Souls-like combat, and then the next entry is a turn-based JRPG, and you're still labeling it as a mainline sequel, then you are betraying the trust and the fandom. And unfortunately, this has come back to bite developers. We saw this happen with the Trine developers, that when they did the move from 2D or 2.5D to 3D, with I think it was Trine 3 or 4, that people found that it just was not the same game. And you have to be aware of that when you are developing sequels to titles. And this is also why many indie developers don't necessarily think about sequels and franchises. They tend to put everything they want into the game in the very first kind of version or iteration of it. They may release expansions, yes, but we don't see studios like Clay immediately rushing to make Don't Starve 2 or Invisible Ink 2. Or even more, or an auction not included sequel, although I don't even know how they would do that right now with all the stuff in it. And again, that's always been one of the advantages indie developers have over the AAA standings. But when you're trying to build a brand and franchise, you have to consider, how do you support your major successes further? Do you release expansions? Do you do spin-offs? And again, how you pitch that to people is very important. Because if you're selling them on a spin-off, then they expect to see completely different gameplay. If not, then you're just making a lesser quality sequel to your main game. But if you go too far away and label it as a sequel, then you betray those fans when you're making a spin-off. Again, it's the loving nature of how you define games. But with that said, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going to talk about games when they don't go too far enough away, and it just seems like a case of milking the franchise. And now for a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. Going forward, all Patreon supporters will get early access to our videos. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. There's always that fine line when it comes to developing a sequel for a game in terms of how much you carry over from the previous iterations. And in the first part, we talked about a game like Fam Doctrine that seems to be going too far away. But what about when a sequel doesn't go far enough or dials things back? And that is very much the issue that Blizzard ran into with Diablo 3 here. When Diablo 3 was announced, a lot of people were excited, again, by the fact that it's a sequel to one of the most popular ARPGs around. But when they got the game in question, a lot were very disappointed in several key areas. From a design standpoint, loot diversity and design was greatly reduced. The variety of abilities and just the overall long-term planning was cut back. And it took them, again, several years to get the game to a point in terms of balance and progression that it was starting to be a great game. But it never managed to get away from the fact that it just felt like a lesser version of Diablo 2. And this is the other issue when we talk about with sequels to games. That you have to walk that line between essentially just creating a brand new game that's completely divorced and just copying what you have. In other words, there has to be a justification for the sequel in terms of gameplay. And this is why, as an interesting tangent, for a lot of indie developers, we don't normally see sequels to their games. And the reason is that for many indie devs who are working on games for years at a time, they're going to put everything they want into the first or into that final version of the first game. And it's harder to justify a sequel in terms of new mechanics. You can, of course, do things with a new engine, you can upgrade the aesthetics and things like that, but to give players and give yourself a brand new systems and brand new reason to play is a far harder sell. And again, this is why for many AAA companies that they tend to design their games in that form that the first game is the test bed. That's to make sure that this idea and concept works, and then for the sequel, we're going to kind of build our best interpretation of it. And then following that, we see how far we can stretch that and making minute differences. As another example, we could see kind of the downward decline of something like the Batman Arkham series from Rocksteady. The first two games were amazing, some of the best games of the previous generation. And then when we got to Arkham Knight, you could start to see the threads being pulled apart from the gameplay experience. And you need to be really careful when it comes to knowing what to keep and what to remove in a sequel. And normally, Blizzard is really good about this. Again, Blizzard is one of the masters at iterating on design. But with Diablo 3 here, they ran into that classic problem of we're going to remove elements that were considered too minute or too fiddly, but we're not replacing it with anything else. And the whole just dumbing down of the loot system and progression along those lines just really killed the game from the endgame perspective. And of course, let's not forget the auction house system that I think even with the removal, you could still unfortunately see how it affected the gameplay beyond that in terms of loot generation and just the overall design of it. And this is why games like Grim Dawn, Path of Exile, and I'm sure there are a few more I'm forgetting off the top of my head, found themselves in a very lucrative space when the king of the genre slipped off its throne. Now, when you're trying to build a sequel to a game, you're always having, again, to weigh those 2 points of how far do you want to go. Now, another advantage that AAA developers have in this aspect is that you can keep the gameplay and just evolve the story, as we've seen with the Assassin's Creed games before they eventually did settle on changing the gameplay around perspective with, I think, what was it, like 2 or 3 entries ago. And there's always that risk, again, of do people really want to play a sequel to this game? As we've said in the first part, that the reason why AAA and publishers like sequels is that they are a known quantity. But you have to understand what is going to bring people back to a game. And again, as we've said, the double-edged sword of sequels, if you do screw up on one of those sequels, you have just hurt a lot of that popularity and lifespan of that franchise. With Diablo here, I'm sure there are people who are very suspect over Diablo 4. And then they were even more suspect with everybody's favorite, doesn't everybody have phones? Which I'm sure will be repeated at least 20 times in the comments of this video since we're talking about. And that, at the end of the day, is the major risks and, again, benefits of a sequel. Sequels work as long as you're able to maintain that momentum. But the problem is that it's very hard to do that without running into those risks of alienating previous fans. You can only get away with kind of betraying your brand maybe once. And again, you have to be like Blizzard level in order to have that clout. But once you keep repeating that, it's going to be harder and harder to sell people on that brand. And when a sequel to a massive franchise doesn't work, that is a dead franchise. And speaking of dead franchises, you also have to weigh from a publisher standpoint when you're dealing with them just what the expectations are. As the famous example from Dead Space, where I think EA demanded that the game sell, 3 or 5 million copies in order to justify the sequel to a niche survival horror game. And that is going to be our final point for this piece, that when you're designing sequels, you have to be aware of just how far, or just what are the legs of this franchise. If game number 2 in a series sells, let's say, 400,000 copies, you shouldn't immediately then think, okay, we're going to go big for game number 3 and expect to sell 3.4 million copies. Which I'm sure a lot of indie devs are laughing at me saying that. But we've seen what we've kind of dubbed the YOLO effect from a lot of developers, where they'll take a modest success and then try and double or triple down on the next game. And you have to, again, be very careful along those lines. One, you can end up losing the magic of what made the previous game work. Two, you could end up betraying the fans who expected the design of the similar or the previous game and is not there. And most importantly, 3, you could end up going bankrupt and losing all the sales and profits you earned from the previous game trying to make things with the third one or the sequel. And again, this is something that I think for a lot of indie developers watching, you're not really going to be thinking about things along these lines. But it's still a major part of game development and building yourself up as a company and brand. With that said, for those of you watching this, can you think of sequels to games that we haven't covered yet that did a good job of keeping the brand alive? And can you think of sequels that just killed a franchise? And before anyone says it, I know a few will probably say it, the Final Fantasy VII Remake won't be counting on this list. Thank you for watching this video. If you're new, check out the Discord and Patreon link down below, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where I examine the art and science of games. Until next time, take care. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoy things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below, where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.